The smell of boiling potatoes filled the small wooden house long before the sun dipped behind the hills. It was the kind of smell that meant survival, not comfort. For the Carter family, potatoes were not a side dish or a choice. They were the meal, the plan, the hope stretched as thin as it could go. Every evening, the same routine played out. The father, Eli Carter, returned from day labor with tired hands and empty pockets. The mother, Rose, peeled potatoes at the table she had inherited from her own mother, and the children waited, pretending hunger wasn't gnawing at their stomachs. They had learned not to complain. Complaining didn't put food on the table. Love did, and they had plenty of that, even when everything else felt scarce. The Carters lived on the edge of a rural town where opportunities were few and pride was expensive. Eli had once worked at the nearby mill, but when it closed, so did most doors. He took whatever work he could find, fixing fences, chopping wood, hauling scrap, jobs that paid in coins and favors rather than steady wages. Rose kept the house together, sewing patches onto old clothes, growing what she could in the garden, and stretching meals with creativity that bordered on magic. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and forgiving. She baked them, boiled them, mashed them, fried them when oil was available. The children joked about potatoes being their family mascot, but the jokes were softer versions of a harder truth. On the other side of town, beyond a line of old oaks and rolling fields, lived Thomas Grayson, a rancher known for his cattle, his wide-brimmed hat, and his quiet ways. Thomas wasn't flashy rich, but he was comfortable. Comfortable enough to fix a truck without checking his bank account, comfortable enough to feed hands who showed up hungry, comfortable enough to remember what it felt like to have nothing. Years ago, after a drought took nearly everything from his family, neighbors had carried food to his door. He never forgot that. Gratitude, for him, wasn't a feeling, it was a responsibility. Thomas had noticed the Carters in small ways. He saw Eli working extra hours, his shoulders slumped, but his back unbroken. He noticed the children walking to school in shoes that had seen better days. He saw Rose at the local market, counting coins twice before handing them over. He didn't pry. He didn't judge. He simply paid attention. And one afternoon, while loading supplies into his truck, an idea settled into his chest with a quiet certainty. He wasn't going to make a donation. He wasn't going to write a check. He was going to share. That evening, as the Carters sat down to their familiar meal, potatoes with a sprinkle of salt and a small pat of butter saved for special days, there was a knock at the door. Knocks were rare. Rose wiped her hands on her apron and opened it cautiously. Thomas stood there with a gentle smile, his truck parked out front, the bed loaded with covered dishes, baskets, and crates. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas tipped his hat and said, "Evenin'. I was making supper and figured it'd be better if we shared." Eli stepped forward, confused and embarrassed all at once. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "But I want to." The children peeked around the doorway, eyes wide. The smell coming from the truck wasn't potatoes. It was roasted chicken, fresh bread, beans slow-cooked with herbs, vegetables pulled straight from the earth, and a pie that looked like it belonged in a window display. Rose felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. She hadn't tasted pie in years. They cleared the table, making space as Thomas brought dish after dish inside. He didn't rush. He didn't make a show of it. He placed the food down as if it belonged there, as if it had always been meant for this table. When everything was set, he pulled up a chair. "Let's eat," he said simply. For the Carters, the first bites were overwhelming. The children chewed slowly, savoring flavors they had almost forgotten. Eli swallowed hard, his throat tight. Rose closed her eyes for a second, letting gratitude wash over her like warmth after a long winter. No one spoke much at first. Food has a way of humbling you when you've gone without. Thomas watched quietly, not with pity, but with satisfaction, the kind that comes from doing something that feels right. As the meal went on, conversation found its way in. Thomas talked about the ranch, about the calves born that spring, about the old fence that still needed fixing. Eli shared stories from the mill, the good years, and the hard lessons. Rose laughed when Thomas praised her potatoes, admitting he'd never tasted them quite like she made them. The children asked 100 questions, their voices bright, their plates refilled without hesitation. When the table was cleared and the last crumbs brushed away, Thomas stood to leave. Rose tried to pack leftovers into containers, apologizing for taking too much. Thomas stopped her gently. "They're yours," he said. "All of it. And if you don't mind, I'll come by again. Sharing's better when it's regular." That night, after Thomas drove away, the Carters sat in a quiet that felt different. It wasn't the silence of worry or counting what was left. It was the peace of knowing they weren't alone. Eli looked at Rose and said, "We'll pay this forward." She nodded, already thinking of ways. And they did. When Eli found steady work repairing farm equipment, he helped neighbors without asking for extra pay. Rose taught other families how to stretch meals, how to grow more with less. The children shared lunches at school, remembering how it felt to be hungry. Thomas continued to visit, sometimes with food, sometimes just with stories and a willingness to listen. The table became a place of gathering, not scarcity. Word spread, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Other ranchers brought produce. Bakers dropped off bread. Hunters shared meat during the season. What started as one shared meal became a quiet movement of generosity. No headlines, no cameras, just people choosing to see and to act. Years later, when the Carters' house had fresh paint and the children were grown, Rose would still make potatoes, but now they were a comfort, not a necessity. And every time she served them, she remembered the knock at the door, the feast carried in without fanfare, and the simple words that changed everything. Let's share. Stories like this remind us that kindness doesn't need permission, and generosity doesn't require abundance, only intention. If this story warmed your heart and reminded you of the power of sharing, consider subscribing to the channel and passing it along. You never know who needs a reminder that even the smallest act can turn potatoes into a feast and strangers into family.